My mom said I was overreacting. But how calm would you be if you watched your son sit through 36 gifts for other kids and get nothing but silence? I didn't argue. I went home, rewrote my will, and cut them all out. 2 days later, my dad needed money, my sister blamed me online, and Mom's voice cracked through voicemail, begging for forgiveness she never earned. I'm Evelyn Carter, and this is how I learned peace can sound a lot like revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The highway between Seattle and Portland was slick with snow, a white ribbon disappearing into the gray distance. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the wipers struggled to keep up. The radio played an old Christmas song, something cheerful from the 50s that felt completely wrong for the way my stomach twisted. Noah sat in the back seat, legs swinging, his Batman hoodie zipped up to his chin. How much longer, he asked, pressing his face to the fogged window. 20 minutes, I said. Almost there. He smiled, small and hopeful. Grandma said she baked gingerbread men this year. She did. I said, though I wasn't sure. Every year she said a lot of things. Every year I promised myself I wouldn't go back. And every year I did, because Noah still thought Christmas meant family. By the time we pulled into my mother's driveway, the sun had vanished behind low clouds. Her two-story colonial glowed like something out of a Hallmark movie. Lights framed the roofline, a massive tree shimmered in the bay window, and the air outside smelled like cinnamon and sugar. Wow, Noah whispered as we stepped out. He looked up at the glowing house like it was the North Pole. Inside, laughter burst from the living room. My sister Rebecca opened the door before I could knock. She was in a red sweater dress, hair perfectly curled, a camera already in her hand. Eve. You made it. Her hug was quick, perfunctory, more for show than warmth. Her eyes flicked to my car parked out front. You're still driving that thing. It still runs, I said lightly. She smiled with just her lips. Come on in. Mom's been waiting. The living room was chaos. Wrapping paper on the rug, kids darting around like caffeinated squirrels. Daniel, my brother-in-law, stood behind his phone filming every squeal. Ella, 10, and Lucas, 8, were in matching plaid pajamas, each surrounded by towers of boxes. Mom, Margaret Carter, was in her element, Santa hat mug of cocoa cheeks flushed with holiday pride. Okay, who's ready for another one, she called, holding up a gold-wrapped box. Me. Ella shouted, bouncing on her toes. Mom handed it over, from Grandma. Ella ripped the paper open. A tablet, she screamed. Everyone clapped. Daniel zoomed in. Rebecca wiped tears of joy, as though this was a life-defining moment. More gifts followed. Scooters, video games, new clothes. Each gasp, each shriek made the room louder, brighter, until it felt like there was no oxygen left. I stood near the fireplace, Noah beside me, his small hands clutching the hem of my coat. When Mom reached under the tree again, I caught myself searching the tags before she even read them out loud. To Ella, to Lucas, to Rebecca, to Daniel, nothing for Noah. He didn't say a word, just watched the paper fly. The ribbons hit the floor, his eyes following the motion like he was trying to understand a language he didn't speak. Mom handed another box to Ella. Pink bike helmet, sparkly streamers attached. Oh, Grandma, thank you. Ella threw her arms around her. Mom laughed, high and delighted. Then she noticed me watching. What she said, eyebrows raised. I opened my mouth, closed it again. Nothing. Rebecca glanced over, smiling that tight, polite smile. Don't tell me you're keeping score, Eve. Mom's been so busy this year. She probably just forgot one little gift. Right, I said, forcing a laugh that sounded nothing like me. Noah looked up. Maybe she left it at home, he whispered. His voice was careful, as if speaking too loudly might embarrass me. Mom clapped her hands. Okay, last one. She reached deep under the tree, pulled out a flat envelope. Ah, this must be for you, Becky. Rebecca laughed, dramatic and perfect for the camera. You shouldn't have. I watched her open a gift card for a weekend spa retreat. My throat burned. The smell of cinnamon suddenly turned sickly sweet. When the last shred of paper hit the floor, the room quieted just enough for Noah to whisper, That's all of them. I nodded. Mom began collecting mugs and wrappers, humming. Well, that's another successful Carter Christmas, she said brightly. Then glancing at me, she added, Don't start, Eve. I can tell from your face. Don't make a big deal out of nothing. Nothing, I said, my voice soft. She shrugged. It's just a present. He'll forget by tomorrow. Rebecca laughed. You know how Eve gets sentimental. The heat in my face rose, but I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. I bent down to Noah. Hey, buddy. You tired? He shook his head. No, I'm okay. But his small shoulders had curled inward. Let's get your coat, I said. Eve, Mom began, but I was already on my knees pulling Noah's jacket from the chair, guiding his arms through the sleeves. The zipper rasped as I pulled it up, a sharp sound cutting through the quiet. Daniel lowered his phone. You're leaving already. We have a long drive, I said. Mom frowned, setting down her mug. You're overreacting. I said I'd get him something tomorrow. I met her eyes. Tomorrow isn't Christmas. Rebecca sighed. You're always so dramatic. For a second, no one moved. Then I took Noah's hand and turned toward the door. The laughter started again behind us, softer this time, as if nothing had happened. Outside, the cold hit hard, burning my cheeks. Snowflakes stuck in my hair. Noah pressed closer, his gloved hand tight in mine. Did I do something wrong? He asked. I squeezed his hand. No, sweetheart. You did everything right. He looked up at the house lights twinkling in every window. Maybe Grandma will find it later. Maybe, I said, even though I knew she wouldn't. As we reached the car, I looked back one last time. The house glowed against the dark sky, warm and golden, like it was daring me to miss it. For a moment, I almost did. Then I started the engine. The headlights cut through the snow, and in the rearview mirror, the Carter house grew smaller and smaller, until it was just another patch of light swallowed by the night. Every year, I'd promised myself I wouldn't come back. This time I meant it. Rebecca stood up first, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. All right, she said, voice bright and brittle. Let's get a family picture before everyone starts disappearing. Everyone laughed except me. I stayed where I was, my hands resting on Noah's shoulders. He looked up at me confused, as if waiting for a cue he didn't understand. Daniel lowered his camera. Come on, Eve, he said, forcing a grin. Don't make this weird. It's Christmas. They're just gifts. Mom crossed her arms. I told you before, Evelyn. You take everything too personally. This is supposed to be a celebration, not another one of your episodes. I repeated quietly. She sighed, exasperated. You always find something to be offended about. Can we please not ruin the holiday for everyone else? Noah shifted beside me. His small hands twisted in the fabric of his sweater, his eyes darting to the pile of boxes still on the floor. The mountain of color and paper reflected in his pupils, like a wall between him and the rest of them. I took a slow breath and crouched down in front of him. His cheeks were pink from the heat of the room. Let's get your coat, honey. He hesitated. Are we going home? Yes, I said, pulling the jacket from the back of the chair. I helped him slide his arms through the sleeves and pulled the zipper up to his chin. My movements were calm, deliberate, the kind of quiet that always made my mother nervous. Rebecca's voice cut through the silence. You're really doing this. Over one mistake, Mom's not perfect, but she loves you. I didn't look at her. Love doesn't always look like love, I said softly. Daniel gave an awkward chuckle. Don't take this so seriously, Eve. You're teaching the kid to hold grudges. I stood, meeting his eyes. No, I'm teaching him not to mistake crumbs for a meal. Mom made a small noise, half scoff, half disbelief. Evelyn, you've always been so dramatic. Not everything has to be a statement. I reached for my purse. Maybe not. But this one is... Noah slipped his hand into mine. It was warm and trembling a little. He whispered, It's okay, Mom. I'm not sad. I squeezed his fingers. You don't have to pretend, sweetheart. Rebecca stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was the reasonable one. You'll break her heart if you walk out now. She's not as strong as you think. Being sad doesn't kill anyone. I said, still calm, but being humiliated does. I'm done choosing one over the other. Mom said my name sharply, Evelyn. I paused at the doorway, turning just enough to see her. The room behind her glowed gold, the kids still surrounded by ribbons and toys, my sister framed perfectly in the light. Merry Christmas, Mom, I said. Then I opened the door. The cold slammed into us like a wall. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, melting on Noah's lashes. He hunched his shoulders and I pulled his hood up. For a second, all I could hear was the faint sound of carols from inside. Someone laughing, the scrape of wrapping paper being gathered up, life continuing exactly as before. Noah's breath puffed white in the air. Mom. Yes. Did I do something wrong? I shook my head. You did everything right. He looked back toward the house. The lights blurred in the falling snow. "Maybe Grandma will find it later," he said hopefully. Maybe, I said, starting the car. We backed out slowly, the tires crunching over the icy driveway. Through the windshield, the house looked like a postcard. Perfect, warm, untouchable. In the rearview mirror, it grew smaller, with each turn until the lights became a smear of gold swallowed by the dark. For a few miles, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wipers and the faint hum of the engine. My hands shook just a little on the wheel. Noah leaned his head against the window. "I liked the lights," he murmured. "They were pretty," I said. He turned to me, eyes heavy with confusion. "No child should carry." "Will Grandma be mad?" "Probably," I said. "But she's been mad at me for less." That made him smile, just barely. "I'm not cold anymore," he said. "Good," I whispered. We reached the highway headlights, carving tunnels through the snow. My reflection in the windshield looked like someone I didn't quite know. Calm, expressionless, steady. Inside, my heart was still hammering, but the noise was quieter now, more manageable. I thought about turning around, about explaining, but the thought dissolved as fast as it came. There was nothing left to explain. They'd made it clear what place Noah and I held in their world. The further we drove, the lighter I felt, though I couldn't name the feeling. It wasn't peace yet, but it was close. Noah drifted to sleep before we reached the interstate, his head tipped against the seat, lips parted. I reached over and brushed the hair from his forehead. His face was soft, unguarded, trusting. Somewhere outside Olympia, I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The road behind us was empty, a trail of faint tire marks filling with snow. For the first time in my life, I didn't look back. The apartment was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. The digital display blinked 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before Christmas officially ended. The lights from the city spilled in through the blinds, long, thin stripes cutting across the living room. Noah was asleep on the couch, his small body curled under a fleece blanket, one hand still clutching the stuffed penguin he'd had since preschool. I carried a mug of hot milk to the kitchen counter and watched the steam curl and disappear. My reflection in the window looked older than 38. My makeup had faded, my hair was loose from its clip. I didn't look like the woman who'd driven through a snowstorm for family. Or maybe that was exactly what I looked like. A woman finally realizing the distance between blood and love. I set the mug down, walked down the short hallway, and opened the door to my office. The faint hum of the heater filled the space. On the desk sat my laptop, the one I'd built my career on. Late nights, financial plans, portfolios, trust accounts. I sat, entered my password, and waited for the blue glow of the screen to steady my thoughts. The folder was right where I'd left it. Estate Planning, Carter Family Trust, 2015. The name felt heavier now. When I'd created it, I thought it was an act of love. Back in 2010, Mom and Dad had been struggling after Dad's early retirement. I was doing well at the firm then, handling high-net-worth clients, and I wanted to help them secure their future. I'd convinced them to set up a family trust, moved their savings. Added my own contributions, wrote clauses to make sure Rebecca's family would never have to worry. It was supposed to be our safety net. Instead, it became a leash. I clicked open the file. The numbers stared back at me. Won $200,000 in assets, accounts, and investments. I felt a strange mix of pride and disgust. Pride that I'd built it. Disgust that I'd let them use it to keep me tethered to a family that forgot my son existed. My cursor hovered over the beneficiary list. Margaret Carter, Thomas Carter Sr., Rebecca Hayes, Daniel Hayes. One by one, I highlighted and deleted their names. The cursor blinked a quiet pulse like a heartbeat. In their place, I typed primary beneficiary Noah Carter, 90%. Then secondary beneficiary, Northwest Children Foundation, 10%. I read it twice, once as an analyst, once as a daughter. Both times it felt right. I scrolled to the bottom and signed electronically. Evelyn M. Carter. The screen confirmed the change. A small notification popped up. Upload completed to notary link. Document timestamp 12:17 a.m. It was done. No ceremony, no shouting, no revenge speech. Just a few keystrokes and 15 seconds of silence. That's all it took to erase decades of obligation. I leaned back in the chair, exhaled slowly. The lamp cast a warm circle of light across the desk. Outside, the city looked half asleep, faint red taillights moving like embers through the fog. For a moment, I imagined my mother waking up to check her phone, seeing nothing unusual, completely unaware that the ground beneath her had just shifted. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was release, clean and cold. I walked back to the living room. The tree in the corner still twinkled softly, its store-bought ornaments glinting against the quiet. Noah stirred in his sleep. His hair was messy, his lips parted slightly. I brushed a hand across his forehead. He didn't wake. I sat on the edge of the couch and let the hum of the refrigerator fill the silence. I thought about the first Christmas after Dad lost his job, how I'd worked double shifts to buy gifts for everyone, even Rebecca's kids, so no one would feel the difference. How Mom had hugged me and whispered, "You always take care of everyone, Eve. You're my steady one." And how somewhere along the way that praise had turned into expectation. Then, entitlement. The milk on the counter had gone cold. I dumped it in the sink, rinsed the mug, set it upside down on the rack. The small clink it made echoed in the still air. Back in my office, the laptop had gone to sleep. I touched the trackpad, watched the screen wake, saw the confirmation email from my attorney, Clara Benton. All updates received. Changes effective immediately. CB. I closed the lid. My heart was still beating fast, but in a steady rhythm, like it had found its pace again, after years of sprinting. I walked to the window. Outside, rain had started to fall over the thin layer of snow, turning the street into a mirror. Seattle's skyline shimmered faintly in the distance. Noah mumbled something in his sleep, a dream sound soft and content. I whispered to the dark. No one hears the scream inside a quiet person, but sometimes that silence is what changes everything. The clock struck 12:30. Christmas was officially over. I turned off the lights, checked the locks, and sat for a moment on the edge of the couch, listening to the rhythm of Noah's breathing. Tomorrow would come. Calls would come. Excuses would come. But for tonight, there was only the sound of the rain and the quiet relief of a line finally drawn. The next morning, the light in Seattle was soft and gray, the kind that blurred the line between dawn and cloud. Condensation beaded on the kitchen window, distorting the view of the quiet street below. I stood at the counter, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, the smell grounding me in a way nothing else could. Noah sat at the table legs, swinging under his chair, spooning cereal into his mouth as he read the back of the box. He was humming something, probably that song from the Christmas commercial that had been running on repeat for weeks. The normalcy of it all made my chest ache. My phone vibrated on the counter. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen since last month. For a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. Then I sighed and picked up. "Hi, Dad. Eve, he said quickly, skipping past greetings. The truck broke down again. Transmission's shot. They're saying $5,000 to fix it." I leaned against the counter, staring out at the fog. "That's a lot. Yeah, well, everything's a lot these days. Anyway, I was hoping you could help me out. Just this once." I opened my laptop with one hand and pulled up the spreadsheet labeled Family Loans. I didn't need to check it, but I did anyway. 7 entries over the last 5 years, every one of them marked unpaid. The total glowed on the screen, $31,000. "Dad," I said carefully. "I can't." There was a pause, heavy and irritated. "What do you mean you can't? You're the one with money. Don't tell me this is about that Christmas nonsense. It's not nonsense." "Oh, come on," he said, the frustration bleeding through. "You're mad because your mom forgot one present. You're really gonna punish us over a toy. It's not about the toy." I said, my voice flat. "It's about what it meant." Another pause. Then the sigh I'd known all my life, the one that came right before the guilt trip. "You've always been like this, dramatic, emotional. Your mother didn't mean anything by it." I stared down at the coffee in my mug, the dark liquid swirling as if it could give me patience. "That's the problem," I said quietly. "She never means anything by it, but somehow it always costs me something." He scoffed. "You're overthinking it, Eve. Families fight. It's normal. But cutting everyone off, that's not normal." "Maybe not." I said, "But it's necessary." There was a beat of silence, then a clipped fine, before he hung up. The line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The coffee had gone cold. My chest felt tight. Not from anger anymore, but from something quieter. Disappointment that still found new ways to surprise me. I poured the coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and placed it upside down next to Noah's bowl. He was watching me now, spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. Who was that? He asked. Grandpa? I said. Oh, is he okay? He will be, I said. He just needs to figure some things out. Noah nodded like he understood, though he couldn't possibly. Are we still going to the park later? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. After I finish a few things. He grinned and went back to his cereal, humming again, unbothered. The rest of the morning passed in quiet domestic rhythm. The clink of dishes, the whir of the dishwasher, the sound of Noah's sneakers as he ran down the hall. The normal sounds of a small life that still felt enormous to me. By afternoon, the fog had lifted slightly. I was answering emails when my phone started buzzing again. Mom this time. I let it ring. Then again. 10 calls in under an hour. I flipped the phone over screen down and closed my laptop. Ready? I asked Noah. He zipped up his jacket. Where are we going? For a walk. The path around Green Lake was mostly empty, the snow packed down into a thin crust that crunched under our boots. Ducks floated in the half-frozen water, their reflections ghostly in the fading light. Noah kicked at a small mound of snow. It's quieter than yesterday, he said. Yeah, I murmured. It is. We walked in silence for a while. The cold air stung my cheeks, but it felt cleaner than the air inside my apartment, easier to breathe. He slipped his hand into mine. Mom. Are you okay? I looked down at him, his breath puffing little clouds in front of his face. I'm okay, honey. Just a little cold. He nodded, satisfied, and squeezed my hand before skipping ahead a few steps to chase a falling flake. I watched him, this small person, who had already learned how to carry disappointment with grace. It hurt and healed me at the same time. For years I'd mistaken silence for peace. But real peace, I was starting to understand, came only when you stopped waiting for people to change. By the time we reached the car, the sun had dipped behind the buildings, turning the lake into a sheet of silver. Noah climbed into the back seat, yawning. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed again. Mom. I watched the screen light up, then fade to black. I didn't answer. I didn't even feel guilty anymore. Between silence and peace, there's only one breath of difference. And that day, for the first time, I finally learned how to breathe. 3 days passed before my phone really lost its mind. It was a Wednesday morning at the Carter Advisory Group, rain streaking down the glass walls of the conference room. Michael Tran was across from me, sleeves rolled up, pointing at a spreadsheet projected on the screen. We were mid-discussion about quarterly returns when my phone started vibrating against the table. Once, twice, then non-stop. Michael glanced at it, half smiling. Somebody really needs you. I flipped the screen face up. 74 missed calls. The name on top read Mom. My stomach didn't drop. It didn't do anything, actually. I'd stopped expecting anything good to come from that name a long time ago. Michael raised his brows. You gonna grab that? No, I said, turning it over again. Let's finish the revenue section. He chuckled softly. Wish I had your focus. We went back to work. The phone buzzed twice more, muffled against the polished wood. I kept talking, my voice steady, my pen tapping lightly on the notebook. When the meeting ended, Michael gathered his files. You sure everything's okay? Looked like a lot of calls. It's fine, I said. Just family being... family. He gave me a sympathetic look, but didn't press. You're a vault, Carter. I respect that. As soon as he left, I exhaled slowly and unlocked my phone. 10 new voicemails. The list was a stack of identical notifications. Mom. 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 I put in my earbuds and pressed play. Her voice came through shaky, but the tone was familiar. The mix of guilt and control I'd grown up with. Eve, what are you doing? You're destroying this family. Rebecca's been crying for days. Your father needs help with his car. He can't even drive to work. Call me back, please. You'll regret this if you don't. Next message, Evelyn. This isn't you. I raised you better than this. You don't just cut people off. You fix things. That's what family does. Next. I don't know what you told that lawyer, but we can fix this. Let's just talk before you do something stupid. By the 4th message, her tone hardened. You think you're better than us because you have money. You're not. You're selfish. That's what you are. I took the earbuds out before she could finish. The window beside me blurred with rain. The streets below shimmered silver under the headlights, people hurrying across intersections with umbrellas, each of them moving through their own private chaos. When people lose control of you, they call it love, but it's not love. It's panic. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. Then I dropped the phone face down on the table, picked up my planner, and started scheduling next week's client meetings. Like nothing had happened. Because in a way, nothing had. By the time I left the office, the rain had eased into a steady mist. The city smelled of wet asphalt and espresso. I stepped out onto this balcony by the elevators, the chill seeping through my coat. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. I looked up at the skyline. The clouds hung low, soft and gray, brushing the tops of the buildings. I thought about how much energy it took to stay angry, how heavy it was to carry someone else's disappointment. Sometimes the only way to stay whole is to stop reacting. When I got home, Noah was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, crayons scattered everywhere, working on a picture of a snowman with a lopsided hat. He looked up and smiled. "You're late." I know, I said, shrugging off my coat. Traffic was awful. "Wanna see?" He held up the drawing. The snowman had 2 hearts drawn in the middle, one big one, small. I smiled. "It's perfect. Can we have mac and cheese tonight?" "Sure," I said. "Extra cheese." We made dinner together, our usual small routine. Noah stirring while I supervised the stove. The warmth and the smell of butter made the apartment feel softer, less like a fortress. After we ate, I washed his hair in the bathroom sink, the scent of shampoo mixing with the sound of his quiet humming. When he was tucked into bed, I sat on the edge of the mattress and read to him. Halfway through the story, his eyelids started to droop. "Mom." He murmured, voice thick with sleep. "Do you think Grandma's still mad?" I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "Probably, but that's not something you need to worry about." "Okay," he said, and within seconds, he was asleep. I stayed there for a while listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then I got up, walked into the living room, and picked up my phone from the counter. The missed calls had stopped. The silence that followed was almost startling. I opened my contacts, scrolled until I found Mom and hovered over the name. My thumb hesitated for only a moment before I pressed block caller. The confirmation message appeared on the screen. I hit yes. The phone went dark. I stood by the window looking out at the faint reflection of myself in the glass. The city lights flickered behind me, and the clock on the wall ticked softly, marking a line between everything that came before and everything after. Silence isn't victory. It's not punishment. It's just a boundary, a new border drawn quietly, cleanly, and once and for all. A week later, my name was everywhere. It started with an article posted by a mid-tier financial journalist, David Moreno. The headline spread fast. "Financial advisor cuts her family from trust fund, cold-hearted or courageous. Act of self-protection." By the time I arrived at the office that morning, my inbox was already flooded. Some messages were curious, others venomous. A few were from old college classmates who hadn't spoken to me in years. Everyone had an opinion. Michael was waiting by my desk, newspaper in hand. "You've seen this, I have," I said, setting down my coffee. He studied me for a second. "We should issue a statement, something professional, just to keep it neutral. You know how fast these things spiral online." I took the paper from him. My picture wasn't there, but the description was close enough. An unnamed female executive at a Seattle advisory firm recently removed her relatives from a $1.2 million trust. The comment section was split down the middle, half calling me selfish, half calling me brave. "No statement," I said finally. "The truth doesn't need a press release." Michael frowned. "You're trending on Twitter. Or at least someone who sounds a lot like you is." I smiled, tired. Good for her. He wanted to argue, but he didn't. That's what I liked about Michael. He knew when to stop. By noon, clients were calling the front desk, politely concerned. The receptionist transferred 2 of them to me. Both conversations started with the same careful phrasing. "We just want to make sure everything is stable on your end." "Completely stable," I told them each time. "My personal life doesn't interfere with your portfolio." Still, the tension in the office grew thicker by the hour. People whispered. I caught glances that lingered a little too long. I couldn't blame them. Scandal, even minor, always smells better than truth. That afternoon, while I was drafting a quarterly report, Rebecca made her move. A photo appeared on Facebook. Our family 10 Christmases ago. All of us standing in front of Mom's enormous tree. Her caption read, "Family isn't supposed to be divided, like stocks and shares. The post went viral in our tiny corner of the world. Dozens of comments poured in. Old neighbors, church friends, her college sorority sisters. They all lined up behind her writing things like, "You deserve better." Becky and some people forget where they come from. By the time someone sent me the screenshot, my hands were steady, but my jaw hurt from clenching. People love a tragedy as long as it isn't their own. I worked late that night. The office emptied out around 6. The lights dimmed automatically, leaving only the soft glow from my monitor. My eyes burned from staring at the screen too long. When I finally shut everything down, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. Dark circles under my eyes, hair pulled back too tight. I looked like a woman holding herself together with sheer precision. At home, Noah was at the dining table surrounded by colored pencils, a half-finished picture in front of him. He looked up when I walked in. "Mom, you're home late." "I know," I said, kicking off my heels. "Long day." "Look," he said, holding up the paper. It showed 2 stick figures, one big one small, standing under a gray sky filled with blue streaks of rain. Above them, he'd written in shaky handwriting, "Mom and me. We're safe." I froze. "That's beautiful," I said, and I meant it. He smiled proudly. "My teacher said to draw something that makes me feel protected." I bent down and kissed the top of his head. "You did a good job." We ate leftovers for dinner, then watched an old animated movie. Halfway through, he fell asleep on my shoulder. I carried him to bed, tucked him in, and lingered a moment longer than usual before turning out the light. In the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. My skin looked pale, my eyes hollowed by exhaustion. I turned on the tap, splashed cold water on my face, and whispered to the reflection, "You've lived half your life for them. It's time to live the other half for yourself." The sound of the heater hummed through the apartment. Outside, the rain started again, gentle at first, then steady, tapping against the window like a heartbeat. I stood there a long time, letting the words settle. For once, they didn't sound like defiance. They sounded like truth. The courthouse in downtown Portland smelled like rain and polished wood. Cameras lined the steps outside a row of lenses waiting for a headline. I could feel their gaze as soon as the car door opened. The spring air was cool, the kind that still carried a trace of winter. I stepped out, straightened my gray coat, and followed my attorney, Clara Benton, through the crowd. "Eyes up," Clara murmured as we walked. "Don't react. They'll try to get a shot of you looking upset." "I'm not upset," I said. "Just tired." Flashbulbs went off anyway. Someone shouted, "Ms. Carter, did you really cut your entire family out of their inheritance?" Another voice called, "Do you regret it?" I didn't answer. Silence is easier than defense. Inside, the courthouse was quiet, except for the low murmur of lawyers gathering their files. The marble floors echoed under my heels. We entered courtroom 4, a small, formal space lined with mahogany benches. Mom sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped together like she was praying. Rebecca was beside her in a fitted navy suit, posture perfect. Daniel stood next to them, flipping through a binder. My father wasn't there. I wasn't surprised. He never came to clean up the messes he helped make. Clara and I took our seats. She leaned close. "Don't speak unless I cue you." "I won't," I said. The bailiff announced the judge's arrival. We all stood. Judge Simmons, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, took her seat. "You may proceed." Daniel adjusted his tie and began, "Your Honor, my clients, Margaret and Rebecca Hayes, seek restitution for the trust funds unlawfully diverted by Ms. Evelyn Carter. These funds were intended to support the family unit, not to enrich a single beneficiary." The words slid through the air like oil. Clara's pen scratched across her legal pad, calm and methodical. Daniel continued, gesturing toward me. "My client's daughter used her position as financial manager to remove them from the trust, claiming moral justification. But the fact remains she exploited a position of trust to seize assets that were never solely hers." Clara rose. "Your Honor, the trust in question was created, funded, and legally owned by my client. The documentation you'll find in Exhibit A," she lifted a folder, "shows the 2015 signatures of all parties notarized granting Ms. Carter full discretion as trustee. The trust is her property to manage, amend, or dissolve as she sees fit." Judge Simmons nodded slightly, flipping through the papers the clerk handed over. "Continue." Clara stepped forward, her tone even. "My client isn't on trial for theft. She's being punished for setting a boundary. And that, Your Honor, is not a crime." The courtroom went still for a moment. I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then my mother stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I just want fairness," she said. Her voice cracked. "I want to know that after everything I've done for her, I won't be left out in the cold." Clara didn't interrupt. The judge looked up. "Fairness," she repeated, her voice soft but steady. "Tell me, Mrs. Carter, when is your grandson's birthday?" Mom blinked, startled. "His birthday?" "Yes," the judge said. "When was the last time you saw him?" "Of course I know." Mom said quickly, flustered. It's in March. The 15th, I believe." "It's the 12th." I said quietly before I could stop myself. The judge turned to her. "And how old is he?" "9, Mom said. "He's 8, the judge corrected. Then she looked at me. "You may speak." I stood slowly. "Your Honor." I said I didn't erase my family. I erased a pattern. I built that trust to give them security, and they used it to measure my worth. I learned that kindness can turn into currency when people think you owe them. I stopped paying. Daniel opened his mouth to object, but the judge raised a hand. Mom's face went pale. Rebecca stared at the table, jaw tight. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Carter, do you have anything else to add?" "Yes," I said, feeling the words rise from somewhere deep and old. "Generosity isn't supposed to be accounted for like a balance sheet. Love isn't a transaction. And the moment you start keeping score, it stops being love." The courtroom fell silent. For a long second, the only sound was the judge's pen tapping against her notepad. Then she spoke. "This court finds no evidence of misappropriation. The trust was legally constructed and lawfully amended. The petition is dismissed." Rebecca's face flushed red. She leaned toward Daniel, whispering harshly. Mom stayed seated, her shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. When the gavel struck, the echo felt final. Clara began packing her files, her movements efficient, unhurried. "You did fine," she said under her breath. Outside, the reporters were still waiting. Microphones shot out like arrows. "Ms. Carter, do you have any comment?" I paused at the top of the courthouse steps. The clouds had broken just enough for a weak line of sunlight to spill across the pavement. "I didn't win anything today." I said, my voice clear. I just kept the little bit of respect I had left. Cameras flashed again, capturing my face mid-sentence. Clara placed a hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward the car. As we drove away, the courthouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, smaller and smaller, until it was just another gray shape in a city full of them. Justice doesn't come from winning. It comes from the day you finally stop having to explain yourself. 3 months later, summer settled over Seattle like a soft, heavy blanket. The air smelled faintly of salt from the bay, and rain baked into concrete. I was sitting at my desk sorting through client files when the envelope arrived. Plain white, no return address, the kind banks use when the news isn't good. Inside was a single page from Portland First National notice of account suspension. Outstanding balances. My parents' names were printed neatly at the top. Their accounts had been frozen for delinquent credit payments, and pending foreclosure was in review. I stared at the letter for a long time, tracing my mother's name with my thumb. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years ago, I'd built their financial safety net. Now I was watching them fall through it. By afternoon, the news had spread. Rebecca's marketing firm had lost its biggest client after an ethics complaint. Daniel had been suspended from his law practice for a conflict of interest, which in legal terms meant we finally caught you doing something stupid. When people talked about karma, they always imagined lightning or divine retribution. In my experience, karma just waited. It let people build their own storms, then quietly handed them the umbrella they forgot how to use. My phone started ringing again. The same number I'd blocked months ago. I didn't unblock it, but the voicemails came anyway, piling up in my inbox. "Eve," my mother's voice said, raw and thinner than I remembered. "Please, call me. I'm not angry anymore. I just need to talk. We lost the house. There's nowhere to go." Her breath hitched on the recording. "I don't know what to do. I don't know where to stay. Please." I set the phone down on the counter and just stared at it. The city light filtered through the blinds, striping the kitchen in gold and gray. I waited for the guilt to come. The old reflex that used to twist in my gut whenever she cried. It didn't. All I felt was stillness. Noah was on the floor near the window building something out of Lego bricks. He looked up when he noticed me standing there too long. Who was that grandma? I said, "Is she okay?" I hesitated. "Not really." He frowned. "Can we help?" I knelt beside him, brushing his hair off his forehead. Not every wound needs a bandage, buddy. Sometimes people have to feel it to understand it. He nodded, though his face stayed troubled. He went back to stacking his bricks quiet. Now the kind of quiet that made me want to explain more. But I didn't. Some truths are kinder when they arrive later. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I walked through the apartment, turning off lights one by one. When I reached the dining table, something small caught my eye, a folded piece of notebook paper beside Noah's pencils. In crayon, he had written, "Dear Grandma, I still miss you. I hope you're okay. Love, Noah." I sat down, unfolded the paper fully, and read it twice. His handwriting tilted upward at the end of every line, like he was trying to keep hope from falling. For a minute, I thought about mailing it. Then I folded it carefully and slipped it into the small wooden box on my bookshelf, the one that already held his first report card, a family photo from years ago, and the key to the old Portland house I hadn't visited since. I lit a single candle on the counter, the wax pooling slowly, the flame casting long shadows on the wall. The letter sat in the box edges, curled slightly where his hand had pressed too hard. I rested my fingers against the lid and let the warmth of the candlelight spill across my face. Forgiveness isn't about giving someone another chance. Sometimes it's just choosing not to carry their weight anymore. I closed the box, gently blew out the candle, and listened to the small whisper of smoke that followed. Thin, fleeting, gone. The air inside Carter Advisory felt different the following week. Tense, expectant, almost electric. Even the sound of the printers seemed sharper. Rumors travel faster than numbers ever will, and by Monday morning the whispers had found their way into every corner of the firm. 2 clients had already requested temporary account holds, citing concerns about fiduciary transparency, which in plain English meant, we read something online and got scared. Michael Tran appeared in my doorway. His expression caught between worry and loyalty. "Eve, you've got a minute." I nodded, setting down the file I'd been reviewing. He closed the door behind him. "The audit committee's coming this afternoon. Compliance wants to review best practices. It's not an official investigation, but..." He trailed off. "It looks like one I finished for him." He rubbed the back of his neck. "If you don't make a statement soon, they'll believe what's out there. People fill silence with stories." I leaned back in my chair. "Then let them. The numbers don't need my permission to speak." Michael sighed. "You're a mystery, Carter." "I'm consistent," I said. "That's rarer." By noon, the boardroom was packed. Executives, compliance officers, and 3 members of the internal audit committee, all flipping through thick binders of reports. The smell of burnt coffee and anxiety lingered in the air. I stood at the head of the table, hands clasped loosely in front of me. "You've all read the claims I began. You've seen the article, the screenshots, the speculation. None of that matters. What matters are the numbers." I connected my laptop to the projector. The first slide appeared, Carter Advisory, Financial Operations Review 2021 to 2024. Every figure, every transaction, every quarterly statement I'd managed during those years was in that file. "We'll go line by line," I said. "No summaries, no redactions. Full transparency." For the next 3 hours, I walked them through every audit trail, client authorization, and regulatory filing. I explained the firm's compliance ratios, the investment allocations, the tax records. Every slide ended with the same conclusion, no discrepancies. By 4 p.m., the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air in the room felt heavy. One of the committee members, a man named Graham, cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, forgive the bluntness, but why not just clear your name in the press? Because that's not where my name was built." I said, "It was built here, in these ledgers." He nodded slowly, flipping to the last page of the report. "Everything checks out. Flawless work." The chairwoman of the board, a silver-haired woman named Denise, looked up from her notes. "We owe you an apology, Evelyn." "The firm does." Her voice was steady, but her expression softened for the first time in weeks. I inclined my head. "Apology accepted." She closed her folder. "We're not just clearing your record. We're promoting you. Effective immediately. You'll be taking over as Regional Chief Financial Officer." For a moment, the room was silent. Michael, sitting near the back, broke into a small grin. I exhaled the tension, leaving my body like air from a punctured tire. "Thank you," I said simply. The meeting adjourned around 6. People filed out with cautious smiles, a few nods of respect I hadn't seen in months. When the door finally closed behind the last person, Michael leaned against the frame. You realize you just made every auditor in this company question their career choices. I laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar after so many months of restraint. They did their jobs, so did I. He studied me for a beat. You didn't just save the company today, Eve. You reminded everyone why they trusted you in the first place. I smiled at him, genuine this time. Then I guess the math worked. After he left, I walked out onto the small balcony adjoining the boardroom. The sky was painted in streaks of pink and gray, the kind of twilight that makes the whole city shimmer. Seattle stretched out below, glass towers catching the last of the light ferries moving across the bay like slow, glowing dots. I leaned on the railing, letting the wind hit my face. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was standing in defense of something. I just felt steady. You don't need to shout to be seen. You just have to stand still long enough for the noise to pass. When I stepped back inside, my phone buzzed on the table. A news alert. Moreno financial report, retracted. Editor's note, sources found unverified. I stared at the screen for a second, then smiled, quiet and small. The same silence that had once been my weakness was now my shield. The article about the Carter family trust was gone, erased from every major outlet within the hour. Outside, the city lights blinked on one by one, as if the whole skyline had exhaled with me. The first day of October brought a thin layer of fog over Seattle, the kind that softened everything it touched. The office smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. I was reviewing quarterly reports when the receptionist buzzed my line. "Ms. Carter," she said, "there's a young girl here asking for you. Says her name is Ella Hayes." My hand froze for a moment on the mouse. "Send her up." A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and there she was, 12 years old, taller than I remembered, hair, the same sandy brown as her mother's. She held a small, cream-colored envelope against her chest. "Hi, Aunt Evelyn," she said shyly. "Hi, Ella." I stood, gesturing toward the chair across from my desk. "You look grown up." She smiled a little. "Grandma says that too." Then she held out the envelope. "She told me to give you this." I took it carefully, the paper soft from being handled too many times. "Did she tell you what's inside?" She said it's something you'd remember. I opened it. Inside was an old photograph. Mom sitting on the couch, holding Noah when he was maybe 4 years old. He was laughing, reaching toward the camera. Behind them, a Christmas tree glowed with colored lights. My throat tightened. I didn't know she still had this. "She keeps it in a box," Ella said, swinging her feet under the chair. "She told me you probably think she hates you, but she doesn't. She said she made mistakes, that she thought being silent made her strong, but now she knows it just made her lonely." I set the photo on my desk, smoothing its worn edges. "That sounds like something she'd say now," I murmured. Ella watched me carefully. "She said you misunderstood her, but that the misunderstanding was her fault. She wanted me to tell you that." I smiled, small and a little sad. Your grandma always did like the last word. She also said, Ella added quickly, that she's proud of you, even if she doesn't know how to show it. I looked at the picture again. My mother's eyes in it were softer than I remembered. "Thank you for bringing this," I said. "Do you want something to drink?" "I think there's still some cocoa in the break room." Her face brightened. "Really? Mom never lets me have cocoa after school." "Well, lucky for you, I'm not your mom." While I made the cocoa, she wandered around my office studying the framed certificates and pictures on the wall. "Is this Noah?" she asked, pointing to a photo of him holding a science fair ribbon. "It is." "He's taller than me now," she said, pretending to sound annoyed. "He'll love to hear that." When I returned with the mug, she blew on it carefully before taking a sip. "Grandma told me to tell you one more thing," she said after a pause. "Oh, she said courage can skip a generation, but it doesn't disappear." I let that settle in the air between us. "Your grandma sounds wiser these days." Ella shrugged. She said losing things made her think. She didn't say what she lost, but I think she meant you. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I reached across the desk and touched her hand lightly. "Tell her I heard her okay." "That's enough." Ella smiled, her eyes shining. "I will." We talked for a while longer, about her classes, her friends, the art project she was working on for school. When she mentioned Rebecca, her tone changed. "Mom's been quiet lately," she said. "She's not mad at you anymore. I think she's just scared to say sorry." "That's okay," I said gently. "Sometimes sorry takes a while to find its way out." She nodded like she understood. When it was time for her to leave, I walked her to the lobby. Noah was waiting by the elevator. He'd come to walk home with me. He stared at Ella with the awkward curiosity of two kids who used to play together, but no longer knew the rules. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he answered. They stood there for a moment, then Ella smiled and pressed the button for the elevator. When the doors opened, she turned back to me. "Thanks for the cocoa." "Anytime," I said. "And Ella, thank you for coming." She nodded, holding the envelope close to her chest as she stepped inside. The doors closed, and the quiet filled the hallway again. Noah looked up at me. "Was that Ella?" "Yeah," I said. He hesitated. "Did Grandma send her?" "She did." He was quiet for a moment, then asked softly, "Is Grandma still mad?" I thought about the photograph on my desk, the way my mother's arms held my son, like he was something precious. Maybe not. I said, "Maybe she's just learning a different way to love." He nodded, satisfied with that answer. Later, back in my office, the late afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows, bathing everything in gold. I picked up the photograph again, tracing Noah's tiny hand frozen midair, reaching toward the camera. Or maybe toward me. I set it on the corner of my desk where the light hit it just right and let myself breathe. Not everyone has the courage to admit when they've been wrong. But courage, like kindness, has a way of finding its way back through the generations. 1 year passed quietly, the kind of year that changes you in small, invisible ways. The apartment felt warmer now, fuller somehow, like every corner had finally learned how to breathe again. It was Christmas Eve. The sky outside glowed faintly with snowlight, and our living room smelled of cinnamon and pine. Noah had insisted on a tall tree this year, one almost too big for the space, and he'd covered it with paper stars he'd cut himself. Some were lopsided, some folded wrong, but under the lights they shimmered like they belonged there. "Hold this," he said, handing me a strip of tape. His fingers were dusted with glitter, his hair sticking up at odd angles. I passed it to him and watched as he carefully stuck another star near the top. "Perfect," I said. He stepped back, hands on his hips, nodding like a tiny architect admiring his masterpiece. "Do you think it's too much? Not possible," I said. "Christmas trees don't believe in too much." He grinned. "Good." On the coffee table, a stack of thank you cards waited. Notes for friends, co-workers, and the handful of people who'd stood beside us during the hard months. We'd been writing them together all week. Noah picked up the last one, holding the pen awkwardly. "Who's this one for again, Ms. Rodriguez?" I reminded him. "Your teacher." He wrote carefully, tongue poking out in concentration. When he finished, he looked up. "Should we send one to Grandma?" I froze for a second, the question hanging in the soft air between us. Then I smiled. "No need, honey. She already knows." He seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded, satisfied. "Okay." We moved to the kitchen where the oven was already preheating. The countertop was a mess. Flour dusted like snow mixing bowls stacked at odd angles, cookie cutters shaped like stars, and reindeer scattered everywhere. "Ready for gingerbread?" I asked. "Yes." He jumped up, clapping his hands. "Can I do the frosting this time?" I raised an eyebrow. "You remember what happened last year?" He laughed. "Yeah, but I've been practicing." "You've been practicing?" He nodded, completely serious. "With toothpaste. I couldn't help it." I burst out laughing. "That explains why we're always out of Crest." As we worked, the radio played softly in the background, somewhere between the rolling pin and the baking tray. "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" came on. Judy Garland's voice filled the room, tender and haunting, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel that familiar ache in my chest. I just let it play. Noah started singing along, half a beat behind his voice, small but sure. I joined him for the last line. When the cookies were finally in the oven, we sat on the floor by the tree, waiting for the smell to fill the apartment. The lights flickered softly, casting golden halos on the walls. "Mom," Noah said quietly. "Yeah, this feels like the best Christmas ever." I smiled. "You say that every year." He shrugged. "Because it keeps being true." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "Merry Christmas, love you." I stood there for a long moment staring at the words. The message wasn't angry or pleading. It wasn't trying to guilt me or pull me back. It was simple, fragile, almost human. Noah looked up. "Who's that?" "Just a message," I said, setting the phone down. My thumb hovered over the screen for one heartbeat longer than necessary before I pressed delete. The notification vanished. The silence that followed didn't feel heavy this time. It felt clean. When I turned back, the cookies were ready. Noah rushed to open the oven, a puff of warm air spilling out. "They smell amazing," he said. eyes wide. Careful, I warned, handing him the mitts. Don't burn yourself. He slid the tray onto the counter and leaned close, breathing in the scent. They look perfect. They are perfect, I said, ruffling his hair. He looked up at me, serious for a moment. Mom. Yes, you're happy, right? I felt the answer settle deep inside me before I said it. Yeah, honey, I am. He smiled, satisfied, and reached up to hang one last star near the window. Outside, the snow had started again, slow and steady, each flake catching the glow of the streetlights. I pulled him into my arms, pressing a kiss to his forehead. His hair smelled faintly of sugar and soap. The tree lights reflected in his eyes, making them sparkle like he'd swallowed a bit of the sky. Mom, he whispered, what do you want for Christmas? I looked around, the stars, the cookies, the laughter still hanging in the air, and shook my head. Nothing, I already have it. He leaned against me, and for a while we just watched the snow fall in silence. The radio kept playing soft and steady, as if the world had finally learned to hum along. Outside, the city was wrapped in white. Inside, everything we needed was right there. Warmth, light, and the quiet, certainty that we were exactly where we were meant to be. Christmas didn't need fixing anymore. It just needed us. The first morning of 2025 broke quiet and pale over Lake Union. From my office window, the city looked washed clean, rooftops dusted in white, the water below glazed with a thin shimmer of ice. The air inside smelled faintly of paper and cedar, the remnants of the holidays fading into routine again. I sat at my desk sorting through old files, the kind of work that doesn't really need doing but steadies the mind. Each folder carried a piece of the past clients I'd guided, through retirements accounts that had long since closed, letters of gratitude filed under miscellaneous. And then, on the corner of the desk, the wooden box waited. It had been there for years now, always within reach, always unopened for long stretches of time. Inside were the pieces I'd chosen to keep. The letter Noah once wrote to my mother, the photograph Ella brought me of that long-ago Christmas, and the notarized copy of the Carter family trust. Edges still crisp, even after everything it had cost us. I lifted the lid, running a finger along the box's edge. The paper inside smelled faintly of dust and old ink. 8 years. 8 years since I'd created that trust to keep them safe. 8 years since I realized safety means different things to different people. For them, it meant control. For me, it meant freedom. I picked up the trust document, held it in both hands for a moment, then reached into the drawer for a lighter. The small flame flickered alive, trembling in the still air. I touched it to the corner of the page. The fire spread quickly, curling the edges inward, the paper turning from white to deep orange before collapsing into ash. I opened the window just enough to let the cold air rush in. The ashes drifted out into the wind, scattering over the lake below, tiny black flecks dissolving into something larger, quieter. Noah's voice came from behind me. Mom, what are you doing? I turned to find him standing in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in every direction. Cleaning up, I said, smiling. Making space for new memories. He stepped closer. Eyes curious but calm. Was that the trust thing? Yeah. He nodded, thinking. So it's gone now. It's gone, I said. Exactly where it belongs. He looked out the window at the drifting smoke. It's kind of pretty, he said. It is, I agreed. Even endings can be. We got our coats and stepped outside a little later, walking down to the waterfront path. The city was quiet, in that special way it only is on the first day of a new year, half asleep, half waiting to begin again. The snow was light, more like powdered sugar than ice clinging to our boots as we walked. Noah kicked at a patch of frost, watching it scatter. Mom, he said. After a minute, I think Grandma understands now. I smiled at the certainty in his voice. Maybe she does. I said, maybe that's enough. He slipped his gloved hand into mine. Do you miss her? I thought about that. About the photo, the letter, the fire. About how grief can lose its sharp edges until it's just something you hold without noticing. I miss what I wanted her to be, I said. But not who she was. He nodded, like that made perfect sense. The wind off the lake was cold, carrying the faint sound of church bells somewhere downtown. We stood for a moment, watching the water move, thin ripples breaking through the ice. Above us, a flock of birds cut across the gray sky, wings beating slow and steady. I felt something ease in my chest then, not joy exactly, but peace, deep and solid. The kind that doesn't depend on anyone else keeping it for you. Some calls don't need answering. Some stories don't need retelling. We started walking back toward the apartment, our footprints trailing behind us in the snow. Noah squeezed my hand. "Do you think next Christmas will be even better?" I laughed softly. "That's the plan." He smiled up at me, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. When we reached the corner, I looked back one last time at the lake, the sky brightening the city, waking the snow falling just enough to blur the edges of everything. Silence isn't weakness. It's peace. It's the sound of choosing yourself and not needing anyone to clap for it. And if you ever find yourself standing where I did, between kindness and calm, choose the calm. Because sometimes peace is the only justice there is.